Hey guys, in this chapter we'll be going over rendering, lighting, and surfacing. I'm just going to be using a scrap piece of paper for this exercise, and I'll just be setting up a grid of 4x5 squares. So let's start out with hatching. I'm going to be taking my fine liner and a 0.3, and I'm just going to hatch all the way through this first square, and I'm going to try to keep the lines as even and consistent as possible. So what you're doing by keeping the spaces in between these lines very, very consistent is that you're going to create a singular value all the way across. Moving on to the next pen, I'm going to be sizing up to a 0.5, and I'm just going to be doing the same exact thing in both these squares. On this square, I try to keep the lines a little bit tighter, and you'll notice how this square comes across a little bit darker than the one above. And next up we have our 0.7, and now I'm going to try hatching just in a different direction, same thing all the way through. And now I'm keeping the lines very close together, but also since we're working with a thicker pen, the value is going to come across as even darker. Think of the space between these strokes as light getting let in. Alright, last but not least, moving on to a brush pen. And I'm going to take one that's fairly desaturated because I don't want to lose this fine tip. When the inkwell is completely filled up, then the lines get really, really blotchy and hard to control. And I love using this pen just because of the amount of opacity and texture that you can achieve just based on what you're doing. So in this vertical row, I've kept the lines to be almost completely closed off together, but because of the desaturated nib, we're still able to get this kind of grayish tone. Okay, so going back up to my 0.3, on this square, what I'm going to do is actually vary up the direction of my hatching, and I'm going to create a gradient that goes from top to bottom. So the lighter this gradient gets, I'm just letting in a lot more light by spacing out each of these lines bit by bit. I'm also alternating the direction and frequency, and that's going to create a much more organic feel. So you'll notice that the square on the left reads very, very static, while the one on the right is a lot more dynamic and active. And something else we can do while we're rendering is cross-hatching. So in this little square, I'm going to hatch in one direction and then the other. So when you're cross-hatching, just be careful that it doesn't look like a veil that sits over. Instead, what we can do is vary up the lines and the frequency again in order to create a little bit more interest and dimension. And for me, it's just personal preference, but I like to keep my hatching kind of sectioned off like this, moving at different directions, but not having them necessarily cross over too much. But there's no one way to do this, so you guys should just do whatever feels right. So now we've built up a gradient in these two squares. We can actually go back into these squares and build up that gradient, and you can push the darks as dark as you want by just overlapping the hatching over and over again. Now in this next square, I'm going to move on to a medium-sized pen, and let's keep the lines closer together. So the closer together you place your lines, you're actually able to achieve a much more fine gradient. And in this square, I'm going to try to keep the lines a little bit looser and more gestural. And in the next square, I'm going to try to do the same thing, but with really short strokes. And last but not least, we're going to do the exact same thing with the brush pen. And you can see that not only are we creating a texture through the lines, but the brush itself is giving us a lot of interesting texture on its own too. And I'll just be going through the rest of these thumbnails, just practicing that mark making over and over again. And as you can see, it's really minor changes that I'm making for each thumbnail, but it can be really fun to just make little tweaks here and there and play around with mark making that way. And and you guys can definitely be a lot more experimental than I am being right now. Okay, and in this last box, I wanted to do something a little bit more gestural. So I'm pressing down a little bit harder and I'm smudging out these strokes. And here I wanted to show you guys another example with this brush pen. So as you guys can see, when I'm pulling down, that first stroke that I set down, it reads a little bit darker because that's where the ink pools the most, right? And we can actually use this to our advantage to build up that value strongest near that terminator, where that very controlled line is, and have it kind of fade out as we move down. But if that bothers you, there's definitely ways to work around it. Just use a really light touch and build up that value like you would using a fine liner. And also we can get a little bit more gestural like I showed you in that last thumbnail and kind of smudge out the stroke. But just make sure that you're not losing the form if you're going for mark making that is a little bit looser. I want to find a nice balance between something that is controlled and something that is a little bit more chaotic. And really quickly, let's talk about some textures. So I'll just be using different animal textures for this demo. So when you're drawing textures, you always want to think about how it's going to translate when it sits onto a form. But when we're doing these individual callouts inside these thumbnails, we can get a little bit more detailed. So first I'm just going to go in and lay down the underlying structure. And as I'm doing this, I do want to keep the lines fairly opened up. The reason is that if you close up all of the lines, then the texture can suddenly flatten out the form because it sits almost like a pattern onto this three-dimensional form instead of working with it. So by opening up some of these lines, you're letting a lot of light, and it's also going to allow you to build value a lot more easily, therefore making everything look a lot more dimensional. Something else I want you guys to think about is grouping shadows and grouping negative shapes. The more you group these two things together, the more interconnected your texture is going to feel, and instead of just working in spurts all over the animal or the subject that you're drawing, try to strategically place these textures where light is getting introduced to shadow or in areas that are sitting halfway between light and shadow. That's where we're going to get the clearest read. I know I've placed a lot of lines down here, but as I was doing so, I'm also thinking about where I want to place my shadow shapes and where I might keep the negative shapes. I'm going to start out by introducing shadows where there's the clearest areas of overlap and try to group the shape as much as possible. We can also build up these shadows as we go, so don't feel like you have to decide right away what that value is going to be. Also, and I'm going to keep repeating this, but there's never a correct way to sketch or render a form, right? So instead of looking for the right solution, experiment with different choices and see how that affects your form. So now I'm just going to go in with some supplemental shadows that kind of sits halfway between that first initial shadow that I put down, and we can also go strengthen line weights later on. In this case, because we're zooming into the texture so much, we can draw out all these beautiful individual strands, but like I said, when it's actually sitting on top of an animal, you don't want to go through the whole entire thing and draw out every single line. Try to group the shadows as much as possible in order to create shapes to define this form. And let's talk about the direction of your mark making and how that can affect the form. So here I'm creating 2 more thumbnails, just like we did before. And this one on top, I'm just going to hatch diagonally, again creating a consistent value. And on the bottom one, let's go straight up and down. So what does this do to our sketch? It can flatten out an image, also push something back into space. It also can make something look a little bit more artificial or man-made, and it can create a static state as well. Now let's look at the opposite end and create strokes that are a little bit more active. So now I'm going to be varying up direction, distance, and frequency in my strokes. So these marks, in contrast to what's above, is going to come across as a little bit more organic or active, dynamic. So let's apply these 2 principles. I have these 2 overlapping beans here, and since this one is up front, I'm going to assign it a little bit of contours. and that's going to be our main character that we're going to try to draw focus to. So we can take this shape in the back and actually push it back into space by using a static stroke to hatch all the way through. So this bead in the front, let's do the exact opposite. I'm going to be using these active strokes to build up my value. So at first I'm just kind of going through with the placement of it, and I'm going to build up the value to be stronger and stronger just by cross-hatching over it. So when you're rendering, just think about how does it affect the form, because that's what takes priority. We always want the rendering to support the form and not work against it. Alright, so feel free to make your own hatching spreadsheet. I really hope it gets you a little bit more comfortable with rendering with fine liners.